Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen had been invisible for exactly 8 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. Not literally invisible, of course, but she might as well have been a ghost, floating through the corridors of Fort Braxton Military Base in North Carolina. Every morning at 0600 hours, she walked past the same group of soldiers who barely glanced her way. Every afternoon she sorted through mountains of mail while conversations flowed around her as if she wasn't there. "Mail girls here," someone would mutter when she entered the communications center, and that was usually the extent of her acknowledgement. But Sarah Chen was far from ordinary, even if nobody bothered to look past the surface. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Sarah pushed her metal cart loaded with packages and letters through the bustling corridors of the base. Her small frame moved efficiently between the towering soldiers who dominated every hallway. At 5'4" with shoulder-length black hair always pulled back in regulation style, she looked exactly like what everyone assumed she was, just another support staff member doing busy work. "Watch it." "Mail girl," growled Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb as she maneuvered her cart around a group of infantry soldiers. Webb was a mountain of a man, 6'3" with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could rattle windows. "Some of us have real work to do," his buddies chuckled as Sarah simply nodded and continued on her way. She'd learned long ago that responding only made things worse. Let them think what they wanted. Let them believe she was just another pencil pusher who couldn't cut it in a real military role. If only they knew. Sarah had graduated summa cum laude from MIT with degrees in computer science and linguistics. She spoke 7 languages fluently and could read ancient scripts that most scholars spent lifetimes studying. Before joining the Army, she'd worked for a private intelligence firm, cracking codes that had stumped government analysts for months. But when her younger brother died in Afghanistan, she'd enlisted to serve her country directly, not from behind a corporate desk. The Army, however, had different plans for her skills. "Chen, you're small, you're quiet, and you don't cause trouble," her commanding officer had told her during assignment. "Mail sorting is perfect for someone like you." Nice and simple. Nice and simple. The words still stung 8 months later. Sarah reached the mail sorting room, a cramped space in the basement of the communications building. Metal shelves lined every wall, stuffed with packages, letters, and official documents waiting to be distributed. Her workspace consisted of a single desk, a computer terminal, and a radio that crackled with constant chatter from around the base. She began her routine, sorting mail by unit and priority level, but as always, Sarah's trained eye caught details others missed. The way certain packages were wrapped, the subtle differences in handwriting, the unusual return addresses that didn't quite match their supposed origins. "Still playing with your little letters, Chen?" Sarah looked up to see Corporal Jessica Martinez leaning against the doorframe. Martinez was everything Sarah wasn't. Tall, blonde, and assigned to the intelligence unit that Sarah desperately wanted to join. She wore her position like a badge of honor, never missing a chance to remind everyone of her clearance level. "Just doing my job," Sarah replied evenly, continuing to sort through a stack of international mail. "Right. Your job." Martinez stepped into the room, her boots clicking against the concrete floor. "Must be nice having such low expectations. No pressure, no real responsibility, just this." She gestured dismissively at the mail-covered desk. Sarah's hands didn't pause in their work, but her jaw tightened slightly. "Someone has to do it." "True," Martinez agreed with a smirk. "Might as well be someone who can't handle anything more challenging." After Martinez left, Sarah sat alone in the silence of the mailroom. The constant background noise of the base, footsteps, voices, machinery seemed muted down here. She'd grown to appreciate the solitude even if it came with a side of isolation. But as Sarah worked, she noticed something unusual in the day's delivery. 3 packages, all roughly the same size, all addressed to different units on base. The return addresses claimed they were from military suppliers, but something felt wrong. The paper was slightly different. The stamps were positioned too precisely. The handwriting, while different on each package, had subtle similarities that most people would never notice. Sarah's pulse quickened. During her time at the intelligence firm, she'd seen patterns like this before. Seemingly innocent packages that were actually part of coordinated operations. Her fingers traced the edges of the first package, feeling for any anomalies in weight or texture. "Chen!" The sharp voice made her jump. Colonel Harrison stood in the doorway, his expression stern. "What's What's taking so long with today's distribution? Captain Morrison's been waiting for his package for 20 minutes. Sorry, sir. Almost finished. Sarah quickly set the suspicious packages aside and grabbed Captain Morrison's legitimate mail. She'd have to examine the strange packages later, when she wouldn't be interrupted. But as she handed over Morrison's mail, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was happening, right under everyone's noses, and she was the only one who'd noticed. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine tasks and casual dismissals. Webb made another crack about her easy job when she delivered mail to his unit. Two privates laughed when they saw her struggling with a particularly heavy package, making no offer to help. Martinez stopped by again, this time with a friend, both of them talking loudly about their important intelligence briefing, while pointedly ignoring Sarah's presence. By 1800 hours, the base had settled into its evening rhythm. Sarah normally would have headed to the mess hall for dinner, then back to her small quarters for another night of reading and studying languages. But tonight she had other plans. She waited until the communications building was nearly empty before returning to the mailroom. The three suspicious packages sat exactly where she'd left them, innocuous-looking parcels that had somehow triggered every instinct she'd developed during her years in intelligence work. Sarah pulled out a small magnifying glass from her desk drawer, a tool that had raised more than a few eyebrows when she'd requested it for examining damaged mail. Under magnification, the packages revealed even more anomalies. Microscopic scratches on the tape, pressure marks that suggested the contents had been carefully arranged. And most telling of all, tiny perforations in the paper that formed an almost invisible pattern. Her heart began to race. She'd seen this before, a coding system used by terrorist cells to embed messages in seemingly innocent communications. But it had been years since any intelligence agency had documented its use. Most analysts assumed it was obsolete. Sarah carefully photographed each package with her personal camera, documenting every detail. Then she opened her laptop and began running the perforation patterns through decryption software she'd developed during her civilian days. The program wasn't military issued. Technically, she probably wasn't supposed to have it on base. But sometimes old habits were hard to break. As the decryption program worked, Sarah leaned back in her chair and stared at the packages. If she was right about what she was seeing, these weren't just random mail deliveries. They were reconnaissance. Someone was using the base's own mail system to gather intelligence, coordinate movements, or worse. The program chimed softly. Results. Sarah's blood ran cold as she read the decoded message fragments, coordinates, timing sequences, personnel counts, and buried in the coded text, two words that made her hands shake. Operation Blackout. Someone was planning an attack on Fort Braxton, and based on the intelligence embedded in these packages, they knew far more about the base's operations than any outsider should. Sarah grabbed her phone to call Colonel Harrison, then stopped. Who would believe her? The mail girl who everyone ignored, claiming she'd decoded terrorist communications with software she wasn't supposed to have? They'd think she was delusional, desperate for attention, trying to prove she belonged somewhere other than the basement mailroom. But as she stared at the decoded messages, Sarah knew she couldn't just file a report and hope someone took her seriously. Lives were at stake. Her fellow soldiers, even the ones who mocked her daily, were in danger. She had to find proof they couldn't ignore. Evidence so clear that even Webb and Martinez would have to listen. Sarah Chen had been invisible for 8 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. But tonight, that was about to change in ways no one could have imagined. The next morning arrived with the sharp blast of reveille, but Sarah Chen had barely slept. She'd spent most of the night cross-referencing the decoded intelligence with publicly available information about Fort Braxton's operations, and what she discovered made her stomach churn with dread. Operation Blackout wasn't just an attack. It was a systematic plan to cripple the base's communications, disable its defenses, and create maximum casualties during the weekly joint training exercise scheduled for Friday. 3 days away. Sarah dressed quickly in her ACUs, her mind racing through possible courses of action. She needed to get this information to someone with authority, someone who could act on intelligence that could save hundreds of lives. But first, she had to survive another day of being treated like furniture, "Chen, you look like hell," observed Sergeant Webb as she passed him in the corridor. "Late night sorting mail?" His buddies erupted in laughter at the absurd idea that mail sorting could keep anyone up past 9 p.m. "Something like that," Sarah muttered, quickening her pace toward the communications building. Colonel Harrison's office was on the third floor, behind a reception desk manned by Specialist Williams, a young man who took his gatekeeper duties very seriously. Sarah had never actually spoken to the colonel directly. All her assignments came through the chain of command, filtered down through multiple layers until they reached her level. "I need to speak with Colonel Harrison," Sarah told Williams, trying to project more confidence than she felt. Williams looked up from his computer with barely concealed annoyance. "About what?" "If it's a scheduling issue for mail delivery, you need to go through your supervisor. It's about a security matter. I've discovered something that requires immediate attention." The specialist's expression shifted from annoyed to amused. "Security matter? You're in mail sorting." "I know what I am," Sarah said, her patience beginning to fray. "But I also know what I found, and Colonel Harrison needs to see it." Williams leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. "Look, Chen, I'm sure whatever mix-up you found in someone's mail seems important to you. But the colonel doesn't have time for—" "This isn't about mixed-up mail," Sarah interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "This is about a credible threat to this base." "A threat." Williams repeated the word slowly, as if he were talking to a child. "That you discovered while sorting mail." Before Sarah could respond, the office door opened and Corporal Martinez emerged, carrying a folder marked with classification stamps. She paused when she saw Sarah standing at the reception desk. "Problem here, Williams?" Martinez asked, her tone suggesting she was ready to be entertained. "Chen here thinks she's discovered some kind of security threat," Williams explained, not bothering to lower his voice. "Wants to brief the colonel about it?" Martinez's laugh was sharp and condescending. "Oh, this is rich. The mail girl thinks she's found enemy intelligence." She turned to Sarah with mock seriousness. "Let me guess, someone's package was addressed wrong and you think it's a secret code?" Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I have decoded intelligence that indicates an imminent attack on this base. If you would just look at what I've found." "Decoded intelligence," Martinez repeated, sharing a look with Williams. "With what?" "Your super-secret mail-sorting decoder ring? I have software that can—" "Software," Williams cut her off. "That you're not authorized to have on military systems. That alone could get you written up." Sarah's heart sank. They weren't just dismissing her. They were threatening her. "Please," she said, trying a different approach. "Just 5 minutes with someone who has the clearance to evaluate what I've found. That's all I'm asking." Martinez stepped closer, her expression hardening. "Listen carefully, Chen. You work in the basement sorting mail because that's where you belong. You don't have clearance for intelligence work. You don't have training in threat assessment. And you certainly don't have the authority to waste senior officers' time with whatever conspiracy theory you've cooked up to make yourself feel important." The words hit like physical blows, but Sarah stood her ground. "This isn't about making myself feel important. This is about saving lives." "Saving lives," Martinez repeated mockingly. "How dramatic. Tell you what, why don't you write up your little theory in a nice report, submit it through proper channels, and let the grown-ups decide if it's worth their time." Sarah knew that submitting through proper channels would take days, maybe weeks. The attack was scheduled for Friday, 72 hours away. By the time her report worked its way up the bureaucratic ladder, it would be too late. "There isn't time for proper channels," Sarah said desperately. "The attack is planned for Friday during the joint training exercise." Williams and Martinez exchanged another look. This time Williams reached for his phone. "Maybe we should call the MPs," he suggested. Chen's starting to sound a little unhinged. Talking about attacks, bringing unauthorized software onto the base. Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. Not only were they refusing to listen, they were threatening to have her arrested for trying to help. She backed toward the door, her mind racing for alternatives. "This conversation never happened," Martinez said coldly. "You go back to your mailroom, do your job, and forget about playing spy. Because if I hear you've been spreading panic or making wild claims about security threats, I'll make sure you're transferred to the most remote mail depot the Army can find. Understood?" Sarah nodded mutely and left the office, her hands shaking with frustration and fear. As she walked back to the basement, she could hear Martinez and Williams laughing behind her. The mailroom felt like a prison cell when she returned. Sarah sat at her desk, staring at the packages that contained proof of an impending attack, and felt completely helpless. Every official channel had been blocked. Her credibility was non-existent, and time was running out. But as she sat there fighting off despair, Sarah remembered something her MIT professor had once told her. When the front door is locked, smart people find the back door. She couldn't go through official channels, but that didn't mean she was out of options. Sarah opened her laptop and began researching every person on base with security clearance, looking for someone who might listen to evidence instead of dismissing the messenger. Her search led her to Captain David Rodriguez, a communications officer with a reputation for being methodical and fair. More importantly, he had the clearance level needed to act on intelligence. Sarah had delivered mail to his office dozens of times, and he'd always been polite, professional. Maybe he would at least look at what she'd found. But getting to Captain Rodriguez meant leaving her assigned area during duty hours, which could result in disciplinary action. Sarah weighed the risks against the potential consequences of doing nothing. Hundreds of lives versus her military career. It wasn't really a choice. Sarah printed out her analysis, including the decoded messages and her assessment of the threat timeline. She tucked the papers into a regulation folder and left the mailroom, her heart pounding with each step toward the communications center. Captain Rodriguez's office was in the secure section of the building, behind multiple checkpoints. Sarah had never tried to access this area without official business, but she'd observed the procedures during her mail deliveries. She waited until the afternoon shift change, when the guards were distracted with turnover protocols, then slipped through using her general access badge. Rodriguez's office door was open, and Sarah could see him working at his computer. She knocked softly on the doorframe. "Captain Rodriguez, I'm sorry to bother you, sir, but I have something urgent that requires your attention." Rodriguez looked up, his expression curious rather than dismissive. "You're Chen, right? From mail services?" "Yes, sir. I've discovered intelligence that indicates a coordinated attack on this base is planned for Friday." To Sarah's surprise, Rodriguez didn't laugh or dismiss her immediately. Instead, he studied her face carefully, as if evaluating her sincerity. "That's a serious claim, Staff Sergeant." "What kind of intelligence?" Sarah's heart leaped with hope. Finally, someone was listening. She quickly explained about the packages, the hidden codes, and the decoded messages. Rodriguez asked pointed questions, technical questions that showed he understood the implications of what she was describing. But just as Sarah was beginning to think she'd found an ally, Corporal Martinez appeared in the doorway. "Captain Rodriguez, I apologize for the interruption," Martinez said smoothly. "I need to speak with you about Staff Sergeant Chen. We've had some concerns about her behavior lately." Sarah's blood turned to ice as she watched Rodriguez's expression change. The interest and attention he'd been showing vanished, replaced by professional caution. "What kind of concerns?" Rodriguez asked. "Well, sir, she's been making wild claims about security threats, demanding to speak with senior officers above her clearance level, and we have reason to believe she's been using unauthorized software on military systems." Rodriguez turned back to Sarah, his earlier openness replaced by suspicion. "Is this true, Staff Sergeant?" Sarah felt the moment slipping away from her, the last hope of being heard crumbling under Martinez's smooth manipulation. "Sir, the software is just unauthorized?" Rodriguez interrupted. "Yes, sir, but—" "Staff Sergeant Chen," Rodriguez said formally, "I'm going to have to ask you to return to your assigned duties, and I think it would be best if you spoke with the base counselor about these concerns you've been having." The base counselor. They thought she was having a breakdown. Sarah looked from Rodriguez to Martinez, seeing her last chance for official help disappearing. Martinez smiled slightly, a cold expression of victory that made Sarah's stomach turn. "I understand, sir," Sarah said quietly. She turned to leave but paused at the doorway. "Captain Rodriguez, when the attack happens on Friday, please remember that someone tried to warn you." As Sarah walked back to the mailroom, she felt the weight of complete isolation. She was alone in her knowledge, alone in her determination to prevent a massacre, and alone in a system that had already decided she didn't matter. But Sarah Chen had not survived MIT, the intelligence world, and 8 months of military dismissal by giving up when things got difficult. If the system wouldn't listen to her, she'd have to find another way to protect the people who'd spent so long treating her like she was invisible. Friday was still 2 days away. and Sarah was far from finished fighting. Thursday evening came with an autumn chill that seemed to seep into Sarah's bones as she sat alone in the mailroom, surrounded by evidence that no one would believe. 24 hours until the joint training exercise. 24 hours until Operation Blackout would turn Fort Braxton into a war zone. Sarah had spent the day in a haze of routine tasks, while her mind worked frantically on the problem. Every package she sorted, every conversation she overheard, every detail of base operations took on new significance when viewed through the lens of an impending attack. The terrorists, and she was certain now that's what they were, had planned this perfectly. The joint training exercise would bring together units from 3 different bases, creating the largest concentration of military personnel Fort Braxton had seen all year. Security would be focused outward, watching for simulated threats as part of the exercise. It was the perfect cover for a real attack. But Sarah had also noticed something else during her careful observation of the base's routines. The attackers weren't just planning to strike from outside. The intelligence embedded in those packages included details that only someone with inside access could know. Guard rotation schedules, communication frequencies, weak points in the perimeter that weren't documented in any manual. Someone on the base was helping them. As the evening shift settled in and the communications building grew quiet, Sarah made a decision that would have terrified her a week ago. She was going to conduct her own investigation. If the official channels wouldn't listen to her analysis, she'd gather evidence so overwhelming that even Martinez would have to acknowledge the threat. Sarah waited until the building was nearly empty, then made her way to the communications center. Her general access badge wouldn't get her into the most sensitive areas, but years of delivering mail had taught her the building's rhythms, its blind spots, its vulnerabilities. She slipped into the main communications room, where banks of computers monitored radio traffic, satellite feeds, and internal base communications. During the day, this room buzzed with activity. At night, it was staffed by a skeleton crew focused on routine monitoring. Sarah settled at an unused terminal in the back corner, hidden behind server stacks that hummed quietly in the darkness. She plugged in a small device she'd brought from her personal equipment, a signal interceptor that could capture and analyze radio transmissions. If the insider was communicating with the attackers, there might be electronic evidence she could find. For 2 hours, Sarah monitored communications while simultaneously cross-referencing personnel records on the base's internal network. She was looking for patterns, anomalies, anything that might point to the traitor among them. Her MIT training served her, well as she navigated systems and databases. With the skill of someone who understood how information flowed through networks, then she found it hidden in the routine radio chatter of base operations. Sarah detected a series of brief transmissions that followed an unusual pattern. They appeared to be equipment tests, standard procedures that happened daily. But when Sarah analyzed the timing and frequency variations, she discovered they were actually coded messages. Someone was using the base's own communication system to coordinate with external contacts, and the messages were coming from a terminal in the intelligence unit. Sarah's hand shook as she traced the source of the transmissions. The terminal belonged to Corporal Martinez. Everything suddenly made sense. Martinez's quick dismissal of Sarah's concerns. Her convenient appearance during Sarah's attempt to warn Captain Rodriguez. Her detailed knowledge of Sarah's activities and whereabouts. Martinez wasn't just dismissing the threat. She was actively working to silence anyone who might discover it. But as Sarah sat there processing this revelation, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy boots, moving with purpose toward the communications room. Sarah quickly disconnected her equipment and shut down the terminal. But she was trapped in the back corner with no easy way to leave unnoticed. The door opened and Sergeant Webb entered, followed by 2 MPs. They began a systematic sweep of the room, checking terminals and scanning for unauthorized personnel. "No, someone's been in here," Webb muttered. "Martinez said Chen's been acting unstable, might try something stupid." Sarah's blood chilled. Martinez had anticipated her next move and sent security to find her. As the search moved closer to her hiding spot, Sarah realized she had seconds before discovery. She could try to run, but that would only confirm their suspicions about her mental state, or she could surrender and try to explain what she'd found. But who would believe her word against Martinez's? Sarah made a split-second decision. She activated her phone's recording function and slipped it into her pocket, then stood up with her hands visible. "I'm here," she called out, stepping into the open. Webb spun around, his hand moving to his sidearm. "Chen, what the hell are you doing in here?" "I was checking on a communication issue with the mail delivery schedule." Sarah lied smoothly. One of the terminals was showing errors earlier. "At 2200 hours? One of the MPs asked skeptically. "I couldn't sleep. Thought I'd handle it now rather than deal with complaints tomorrow." Webb studied her suspiciously. "Martinez said you might try to access restricted systems. Said you've been making crazy claims about attacks and conspiracies. Corporal Martinez is concerned about the base's security." Sarah replied carefully. "We all are." "Yeah? Well, she's also concerned about your security clearance. Thinks maybe you've been under too much stress lately." The MP stepped forward. "Staff Sergeant Chen, we're going to need you to come with us. Colonel Harrison wants to speak with you first thing in the morning about your recent behavior." Sarah nodded, appearing compliant while her mind raced. They weren't arresting her yet, but they were clearly planning to neutralize her as a threat. Once she was confined or transferred, Martinez would be free to proceed with Operation Blackout. "Of course," Sarah said. "Whatever Colonel Harrison needs." As they escorted her from the communications center, Sarah caught sight of Martinez watching from the end of the corridor. The woman's expression was satisfied, almost smug. She thought she'd won. But Sarah still had her phone, still had the evidence she'd gathered, and still had 18 hours before the attack. More importantly, she now knew exactly who the enemy was. They placed Sarah in temporary quarters under informal supervision, not quite arrest, but not exactly free to go where she pleased either. The MP stationed outside her door was young, probably bored, and definitely not expecting any real trouble from a mail clerk who'd supposedly had a mental breakdown. Sarah waited until after midnight, when the base settled into its overnight rhythm. Then she quietly opened her window and assessed the drop to the ground below, 2 stories, with a drainage pipe running down the side of the building. Her small size, which had been such a disadvantage in dealing with colleagues like Webb, was about to become her greatest asset. Sarah had rock climbed in college, though never under these circumstances. She eased herself out the window, found handholds on the drainage pipe, and made her way down to the ground. The night air was cold against her face, but adrenaline kept her warm as she moved through the shadows between buildings. She had one more place to search, one more source of evidence that might give her the proof she needed to stop the attack. Martinez's quarters. The base housing was arranged in neat rows of identical buildings, each containing small apartments for junior officers and senior enlisted personnel. Sarah had delivered mail to these buildings dozens of times, knew their layouts and security measures. More importantly, she knew that Martinez lived alone in a corner unit with minimal foot traffic. Breaking into another soldier's quarters was a court-martial offense, but allowing a massacre to happen when she could prevent it was unthinkable. Sarah picked the lock using skills she'd learned during her intelligence training, skills the Army apparently didn't think were necessary for mail sorting. Martinez's apartment was Spartanly furnished, regulation neat, and almost completely impersonal. Almost. Hidden in a drawer beneath regulation underwear and socks, Sarah found an encrypted satellite phone and a folder containing detailed base schematics, marked with attack vectors and personnel concentrations. But the most damning evidence was a printed email confirming final coordination for package delivery at 0800 hours Friday morning. The joint training exercise began at 0730. Sarah photographed everything with her phone, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was discovering. This wasn't just intelligence gathering. Martinez was the operational coordinator for the entire attack. She'd spent months, maybe years, in deep cover, gaining trust and access while feeding information to hostile forces. But as Sarah replaced the materials and prepared to leave, she heard a key in the front door. Martinez had returned early. Sarah's mind went blank with panic for a split second, then training kicked in. She moved quickly toward the bedroom window, but she could hear Martinez's footsteps in the living room, moving toward the bedroom. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. The bedroom door opened and Martinez stepped inside, still in uniform but with her sidearm drawn. "Hello, Sarah," Martinez said calmly. "I wondered when you'd finally put it all together." Sarah stood frozen by the window, caught red-handed with evidence of treason in her phone and no way to escape. But as she looked at Martinez's cold smile, she realized something important. The woman wasn't surprised to find her here. She'd been expecting this. You wanted me to find this, Sarah said, the pieces falling into place. You've been leading me here all along. Very good, Martinez replied. Though it took you longer than I expected, I was starting to think you really were just a mail clerk. Why? Because tomorrow, when they find your body and search your quarters, they'll discover all this evidence of your collaboration with terrorist forces. The mentally unstable mail clerk who snapped under pressure and decided to strike back at the military that never valued her. It's actually quite poetic. Sarah's blood turned cold as she realized the full scope of Martinez's plan. Not only was she coordinating the attack, she was setting up Sarah as the fall guy, the perfect patsy who would take all the blame while the real perpetrators escaped. The attack isn't tomorrow, Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. It's tonight. Martinez's smile widened. 0200 hours. While most of the base sleeps and security is at its lightest, the joint exercise was just misdirection, like everything else. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, it'll be too late. Sarah glanced at her watch. 01:15. 45 minutes. You won't get away with this, Sarah said, though she wasn't sure how she could stop what was already in motion. I already have, Martinez replied, raising her weapon. Goodbye, Sarah. Thank you for being so predictably heroic. But as Martinez's finger tightened on the trigger, Sarah threw herself sideways toward the window, shattering glass as she crashed through it into the darkness beyond. She hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact, glass cutting her hands and face. Behind her, she could hear Martinez cursing and moving toward the broken window. Sarah ran into the night, bleeding and desperate, with less than 45 minutes to prevent a massacre that everyone would blame on her. The final act was about to begin. Sarah ran through the darkness of Fort Braxton, her lungs burning and blood trickling from glass cuts on her hands and face. Behind her, she could hear Martinez's voice on a radio, calm and professional as she reported a security breach and requested immediate backup to search for an unstable soldier who may be armed and dangerous. 43 minutes until the attack began. 43 minutes to save hundreds of sleeping soldiers who had no idea death was coming for them. Sarah's mind raced as she moved through familiar territory with new eyes. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every corner could conceal Martinez's Confederates. The base she'd called home for 8 months had become a battlefield, and she was fighting alone. But Sarah Chen had not survived this long by giving up when the odds turned against her. She needed to reach the emergency broadcast system in the main communications center, but that building would be crawling with MPs searching for her by now. She needed proof that Martinez was the traitor, but her phone with the photographs was her only evidence, and who would believe her word against a decorated intelligence officer? Then Sarah remembered something that made her stop running. The packages. The original packages that had started this entire nightmare were still in her mailroom, and she'd documented every detail of their coded contents. More importantly, she'd saved the decryption files on her laptop along with her analysis of Martinez's communications. If she could broadcast that information along with a warning about the attack, Sarah changed direction, moving toward the communications building through service tunnels she'd learned about during her mail delivery routes. The tunnels were meant for maintenance access to the building's utilities, but they also provided a way to reach the basement without going through the main entrances that were surely being watched. As she crawled through the narrow maintenance tunnel, Sarah could hear boots pounding on the floors above her, voices shouting orders, doors slamming as the search intensified. Martinez had mobilized significant resources to find her, which meant the traitor had more help on the base than Sarah had realized, but it also meant Martinez was desperate. If the attack was going to succeed, Sarah had to be silenced before she could warn anyone. Sarah reached the mailroom and carefully lifted the access panel in the floor. The room was dark and empty, exactly as she'd left it hours earlier. Her laptop sat on the desk, surrounded by the evidence that could save lives if anyone would listen to it. She quickly powered up the computer and accessed her files, but as the decryption data loaded, Sarah heard footsteps in the corridor above, heavy boots moving systematically from room to room. They were searching the building floor by floor. Sarah's fingers flew over the keyboard as she prepared a comprehensive data package containing all her evidence. The decoded messages, the communication analysis, the proof of Martinez's involvement, and most importantly, the exact timing and nature of the impending attack. She compressed everything into a single file, and prepared to transmit it to every communication device on the base simultaneously. But as she initiated the broadcast sequence, the mailroom door exploded inward. Sergeant Webb filled the doorway, his weapon drawn and his face twisted with anger and confusion. Behind him stood two MPs, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like laser beams. "Chen!" Webb barked. "Step away from that computer now." Sarah's finger hovered over the enter key. One keystroke would send her warning to everyone on base. One keystroke would expose Martinez and prevent the massacre. But Webb's weapon was trained directly on her, and she could see his finger tightening on the trigger. "Sergeant Webb," Sarah said carefully, not moving from the keyboard. "I know this looks bad, but you have to listen to me. There's going to be an attack on this base in 37 minutes. The only attack happening here is the one you're planning," Webb replied. "Martinez briefed us. You've been working with terrorists, feeding them information about base operations." Sarah's heart sank as she realized how completely Martinez had turned the situation around. Everyone would believe the decorated intelligence officer over the unstable mail clerk. Even now, with proof literally at her fingertips, the system was working against her. "Look at the evidence," Sarah pleaded, gesturing toward her laptop screen. "I have decoded communications, attack plans, everything you need to—" "Evidence you could have fabricated," one of the MPs interrupted. "Come on, Chen. Everyone knows you've been unstable for weeks, making wild claims, demanding to see officers above your clearance level. This is just the next step in your breakdown." Sarah saw her reflection in Webb's weapon sight and realized she was out of time and options. In 36 minutes, people would start dying, and everyone would blame her for it. Martinez had constructed the perfect frame job, turning Sarah's heroic efforts into evidence of her guilt. But as Sarah stared at the laptop screen, she noticed something that gave her one last desperate idea. The building's emergency alert system was still active on her computer. If she couldn't convince these three men to listen to her evidence, maybe she could convince the entire base to wake up and see what was coming. "You're right," Sarah said, slowly raising her hands. "I've been under a lot of stress. Maybe I have been seeing things that aren't there." Webb relaxed slightly, thinking she was surrendering. But Sarah's hands weren't moving away from the keyboard, they were moving toward it. "But what if I'm not?" Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "What if there really is an attack planned, and you're about to let hundreds of people die because you won't look at evidence that could save them?" "Chen," Webb started to say. Sarah slammed her hand down on the enter key. Instantly, every speaker, every computer terminal, every communication device on Fort Braxton came alive with a piercing alert tone, followed by Sarah's recorded voice reading her complete analysis of the terrorist plot, the decoded messages, the timeline, the proof of Martinez's involvement, everything she'd discovered during her investigation. "This is Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen with an emergency security alert. Fort Braxton is under imminent attack from coordinated terrorist forces. Attack will begin at 0200 hours, 28 minutes from now. Corporal Jessica." Martinez of the intelligence unit is a hostile operative coordinating with enemy forces. Webb and the MPs stared in shock as Sarah's voice echoed throughout the base, waking every sleeping soldier and alerting every guard post. But before they could react, the building's lights suddenly went out, plunging the mailroom into darkness. "That's the communications grid," Sarah said grimly. "They're jamming our systems. The attack has begun early." In the distance, Sarah could hear the first explosions as terrorist forces struck the base's perimeter defenses. Alarms began wailing as the base shifted into combat mode, but the coordination was chaotic, hampered by the communication blackout Martinez had helped orchestrate. Webb lowered his weapon, his face pale in the emergency lighting. "Jesus Christ. You were right. We need to restore communications," Sarah said, moving toward her laptop. "I can bypass the jamming if I can access the main server room." But before anyone could respond, Martinez's voice cut through the darkness from the doorway. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," she said calmly, her weapon trained on the group. Behind her stood three men in military fatigues who definitely weren't American soldiers. "Martinez," Webb said, his voice filled with disbelief. "What the hell is this?" "This is what happens when people don't mind their own business," Martinez replied. Chen here should have stayed in her mailroom where she belonged. Sarah looked at the faces around her, Webb's confusion turning to anger, the MPs reaching for their weapons, Martinez's cold smile of victory. Outside, the battle for Fort Braxton was beginning, and inside, the final confrontation between truth and deception was about to unfold. "You know what the funny thing is, Martinez?" Sarah said, stepping forward despite the weapons pointed at her. "You spent all this time convincing everyone I was just a harmless mail clerk. You never bothered to find out who I really was." "Oh, I know exactly who you are," Martinez sneered. "A nobody who wanted to feel important. MIT graduate. Computer science and linguistics. Former intelligence analyst. Expert in 7 languages and 15 different encryption systems." Sarah's voice grew stronger with each word. "You dismissed me because I was small, because I was quiet, because I sorted mail. But you never asked why someone with my qualifications would take that job." Martinez's confident expression flickered slightly. "I came here to serve my country after my brother died in Afghanistan," Sarah continued. "I took the mail job because I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself, even if it meant being invisible. But you know what I learned during these 8 months?" The building shook as another explosion rocked the base, but Sarah didn't flinch. "I learned that being underestimated is the greatest weapon anyone can have." Sarah's finger found the hidden switch under her desk, an emergency communication bypass she'd installed weeks ago, just in case the main systems failed during a crisis. The switch activated a backup transmitter that began broadcasting on all frequencies, cutting through the jamming and restoring communications throughout the base. Instantly, the tactical situation changed. Coordinated defense responses began forming as units received orders and intelligence. The surprise attack Martinez had orchestrated was falling apart as Fort Braxton soldiers rallied to defend their home. "You," Martinez started to say, raising her weapon, but Sergeant Webb was faster. His shot echoed through the mailroom and Martinez crumpled to the floor, her expression of shock frozen in death. The 3 enemy soldiers behind her opened fire, but the MPs were ready. In the space of 10 seconds, the mailroom became a battlefield, then fell silent as the last terrorist fell. Webb stood in the smoke and darkness, staring at Martinez's body. 8 months, he said quietly. 8 months I've been calling you mail girl while you were the smartest person on this base. Sarah moved to her laptop, coordinating the base's defense through her restored communication network. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she directed units, analyzed enemy positions, and provided real-time intelligence to the command center. "Staff Sergeant Chen," came Colonel Harrison's voice over the restored communications. "This is Colonel Harrison. I need you to maintain coordination until we can get our primary systems back online." "Copy that, Colonel," Sarah replied. "I have full situational awareness from here." For the next 2 hours, Sarah Chen ran the defense of Fort Braxton from her basement mailroom, the same room where everyone had assumed she was just sorting letters and packages. She coordinated artillery strikes, directed medical evacuations, and provided intelligence analysis that helped neutralize the remaining terrorist cells. When dawn broke over Fort Braxton, the attack had been completely repelled. Casualties were minimal, thanks to the early warning Sarah had provided. The terrorist plot that should have been a massacre had become a decisive victory for the defenders. Colonel Harrison found Sarah still at her laptop in the mailroom, surrounded by printouts and communication logs. Webb stood nearby, looking like a man who'd had his entire worldview rearranged overnight. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Colonel Harrison said formally, "I owe you an apology." "We all do." Sarah looked up from her computer, exhausted but steady. "No apology necessary, sir. I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Harrison shook his head. "Your job was sorting mail. What you did last night was save this base and everyone on it. Sometimes the job description doesn't cover everything that needs doing." Sarah replied. 3 weeks later, Sarah Chen stood in dress uniform before a reviewing stand filled with high-ranking officers, news media, and fellow soldiers. The ceremony was being broadcast live as she received the Distinguished Service Cross for her actions during what the media had dubbed the Battle of Fort Braxton. But what meant more to Sarah than any medal was the sight of Sergeant Webb in the front row, leading the applause with tears in his eyes. Next to him sat Captain Rodriguez, who had written a formal letter acknowledging his failure to listen when Sarah tried to warn him. "The thing about heroes," Colonel Harrison said in his closing remarks, "is that they're often hiding in plain sight. They're the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones we think we know but never really see." Staff Sergeant Chen reminds us that courage doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it sorts mail for 8 months, waiting for the moment when everything depends on someone nobody expected to matter. As the ceremony ended and people began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by soldiers who wanted to shake her hand, thank her, apologize for their assumptions. But the moment that would stay with her forever was when a young private approached hesitantly. "Ma'am," the private said, "I'm in communications now, and I was wondering, would you maybe want to transfer to our unit? We could really use someone with your skills." Sarah smiled, thinking of all the times she'd dreamed of being asked that question. All the months of hoping someone would see past the surface and recognize what she could contribute. "Thank you," she said, "but I think I'll stay in mail services for a while longer." The private looked confused. "But ma'am, after what you did, you could have any assignment you want." Sarah looked around at the base she'd helped save, at the people who had finally learned to see her clearly, at the mailroom where she'd fought the most important battle of her life. "You know," she said, "there's something to be said for being underestimated. You never know when the world might need someone who's been invisible long enough to see what everyone else missed." As Sarah walked back toward the communications building, she passed the memorial wall where her brother's name was etched in black granite. She stopped and placed her hand on the stone, feeling the connection to the service member who had inspired her to serve. "I kept the promise," she whispered. "I found a way to make a difference." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Fort Braxton, as Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen returned to her mailroom, where a stack of packages waited to be sorted. But now, as she worked, soldiers stopped by regularly to chat, to ask for advice, to treat her like the valuable team member she'd always been. The girl who sorted mail had become the woman who saved lives. And in a basement room filled with letters and packages, she continued to serve her country one delivery at a time, knowing that heroism isn't about being seen. It's about seeing what others miss and having the courage to act when it matters most. Sarah Chen was no longer invisible. But more importantly, she had learned that sometimes the greatest strength comes from being underestimated by those who never bothered to look beneath the surface.